But I would say you want to live a life that is helpful to other people. If you just want to make a lot of money and take care of yourself, God bless you. That's not what I'm interested in. I want to encourage people to live a life where they make a difference in the community and in the nation. And so I would say, whatever you feel you're called to do, learn to pay attention to people. Always have relationships with people and figure out what concerns people have, what things are hard for people in life, where they need help, and try to figure out ways that you can help. I mean, if you're living in Falls Church and you've got kids in elementary school and you begin to meet other parents who they're concerned about the quality of the schools, and run for the school board or whatever you can do. Try to find ways that you can serve other people and pursue them, whether it's through your work or just through your volunteer activities.
Welcome to the Going Big podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Gentry, and this is the place where we celebrate bold moves and big ideas. Each week, I sit down with inspiring leaders, entrepreneurs, and change makers who are making a significant impact in their careers and in their communities. Whether you're looking to level up your leadership, pursue your passion, or just get inspired to take your next big leap, this is where those stories come to life. Now, if you're listening on iTunes, YouTube, or anywhere else you tune into podcasts, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you'll never miss an episode. Now, let's dive in to what it means to truly go big. Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Going Big podcast. I am so pleased to have with me as my guest today, the Reverend John Yates, who for more than 40 years served as the rector of the Falls Church in Falls Church, Virginia, outside of Washington, D.C. Under his leadership, that church grew to a very large congregation, serving so many people, families in the Washington, D.C. area. But in so many other ways, and this is why I wanted to have this interview today and have John as my guest, he has gone big, not only in so many ways in building this church in service to others, training up new pastors, training up other young leaders. He and his wife, Susan, have done enormous teaching for families and marriage, but also led the renewal movement in the broader Christian faith and in the Anglican Church in particular, which we'll get into, but also he's gone big in service to the Lord. And there's a lot to talk about, a lot that we can learn. I think I can still learn from insights that John will share today. John, it's such a pleasure to be with you here in your home.
Yeah, thanks for coming out here.
Well,
Kevin, you make it really easy for me today.
Well, this is a beautiful spot out in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. I know you love it out here. It's always beautiful, and what a great spot to be to have this conversation.
Just perfect. We love having you here.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Well,
I'll just say for the folks, I've known and loved you for many, many years and admire you. And I'm so glad about this Going Big podcast you got. Glad to be a part of it.
Well, you were kind to say that. You know that I hold you in enormously high regard. And another reason I wanted to do this podcast today. So I think we're going to have fun and we're going to touch a lot of different subjects. I think it's going to be helpful to people, all over the world who can listen to a podcast. And I expect people who are listening today, they may be on the one hand, agnostic or skeptical about the Christian faith. On the other hand, there may be seekers and there may be deep, lifelong believers.
Yeah.
So here's the first question. Mm-hmm. How do you think, from your experience, from your learning and teaching and everything, we should think about going big in our lives in the world today?
It's a good question, and I thought about it a lot when I was young. And what I concluded, I believe deeply in the concept of calling. I believe that if we're open to Him, the Lord God will call us into particular ways of serving Him in the world. And the deal is to figure out that area in which you are equipped and called to serve, and then to begin to figure out how to think small and big in that area. I began to realize this when I was in my 20s. My dad was a pretty successful department store executive down in North Carolina. I had two older brothers, and Dad fully expected that all of us would love merchandising the way he did. For my dad, it was a romance. He loved it. And he had me working in the local store 5th grade on, making boxes in the stock room. And I faithfully served my dad there, working part-time all through high school and college. And then when finally the situation came about and I told him I wanted to go to seminary, he was just incredulous. He couldn't believe that I wasn't going to go into the department store business. But I knew that wasn't my calling. I wanted to explore something else. And when you think about going big, I think we have to realize that people have different capacities. And some people have the capacity to go bigger than others. And you don't always know that. So, yeah.
Well, thank you. That has been a very persistent theme throughout all the conversations I've had on this podcast. We're coming up on doing this for a year. And people say, it's all about finding your calling, your gift. Yeah. What is your contribution? But how do you discover that? How do you find that? And many people sometimes don't find it until later in life.
Right.
How did you decide to become an Anglican priest? How did you decide to go into ministry? How did you find that calling? I think it's definitely your calling. You're very gifted in that way. But you said you came upon it at an early age.
It's funny. I didn't. I came upon it in my 20s. I grew up in a very strong family, a strong Christian family, a strong church family. And so from the time I was young, I knew that God is central in life. And I wanted to, I wanted him to be central in my life. But when it came to the church, I didn't meet many, I would say, sharp or appealing or cool pastors, when I was young. And so I didn't think in those terms.
So you didn't see a role model necessarily you wanted to emulate. It wasn't like an athlete or an entertainer. I want to be that person.
Yeah. I knew that the Lord came first in my life. I didn't know what that meant. And the church was important, but I was able to become involved in some Christian youth organizations like Young Life when I was young. That had a much greater impact on me. Then when I went to college, I began leading a bifurcated life. I'll just admit it right now. I was trying to be faithful to God, but I joined a fraternity, and I was trying to lead the good college life at the same time. And there was a lot of hypocrisy in my life, and I had to come to grips with that. The time came when it was Vietnam. We assumed we'd go to Vietnam. All of us, nobody made long-range plans. Then when I went to get my physical with the military, they didn't accept me. I had some sort of physical ailment, and they said, "You're not qualified." And so while I had been in college, I hadn't made any plans, but I had tried to study religion, and college religion courses, they can be confusing. I knew my faith. I knew Christ was my North Star, but I really wasn't sure about some of the things that I believed. And so I decided, look, here I am. I'm 21 years old. I don't have a job. I don't have a responsibility. I don't have obligations. I know my relationship with God's the most important thing in my life. I got to get some of these questions answered. So I said, I think I'll just take this year in my life and study. I decided to go to seminary and study for 1 year to try to figure out, for instance, could I believe the Bible? There were other questions that were fundamental to me, whatever I was going to do in my life.
And that was at Princeton.
That was at Princeton Seminary. It turned out to be a great experience for me. I learned, summer I was studying Greek. I learned that I had to trust my future to God. I wanted to be a significant person. I didn't know what that meant. I know I was very self-focused, and it was just like God said to me, I might be able to use you, boy, but you need to put me first in your life. So that was a big decision. And I made that decision. And within a year, Susan and I were married. We had wonderful years in graduate school. In my senior year, her godfather, who was a missionary bishop in Alaska, sat me down and he said, I don't know what God wants to do with you, but we could really use you in the church. He was an Episcopal bishop, missionary in Alaska. He said, you pray about it. I would love to bring you up to Alaska and set you to work as a missionary among the Indian people up there. But he said, there are many people in the church who need to know the Lord. They're there, they're good people, but they don't really know the Lord. We need young people like you. And Susan and I, as time went by, we heard a calling in the old bishop's words. And that calling was, give yourself to trying to bring renewal in the denomination you grew up in, which was the Episcopal Church. So we never anticipated it, but we felt a strong call, and that's the direction we went in.
Of all the years, I never knew all this. All right, so explain a little bit more about renewal. And by the way, you and Susan are such a team, such a partnership.
Yeah.
It's always been John and Susan Yates and the teaching and the books that you all have done. And we'll talk more about that.
Yeah.
But help us understand, what did you mean by renewal in the church?
Yeah. I'd just say about my wife, somebody asked me the other day, what has surprised you most in all your years of ministry? And the first thing that came to my mind was so surprising, but I said, it was how much I've needed my wife all my life. That surprised me. But anyway, she's just been, in many ways, a senior partner to me. But about renewal, renewal means, it means coming to be assured of a genuine and personal relationship with Jesus Christ. A lot of people believe, but it's not. They want, is it really real? Am I just believing make believe? Renewal means you're sort of coming alive in your relationship with the Lord, and the church, the mainline denominational church back in the 60s was, in a lot of ways, was pretty dry, pretty dead. Yeah. And people were looking for something more. And so that's really what we were called to.
Well, let me ask you more then about sort of the influences of you, because I remember you started talking about people like John Stott when we started going to the church. Like, who's this John Stott? And I remember reading his explanation about a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, which at first mystified me. I was like, what does that mean? That really helped me.
Yeah.
Well, who were some of the other influences for you and maybe for Susan as well? I know you've spoken about your family, your parents, your mother in particular, but people like John Stott and even Billy Graham. Because Billy Graham was so key at that time in our world history.
Yeah, he was a North Carolina man too. And we grew up, he was just lived an hour away. And he had to be a hero if you lived in North Carolina. And of course, we watched him on television. And I can remember when I was a little boy watching Billy Graham with my mother one day, and she said to me, "Son, have you prayed that prayer of commitment?" And I said, "Oh, yeah, Mom, I did that a long time ago." She said, "I want you to be sure, son." I said, "Oh, Mom, I am sure." She said, "I want you to be sure. I want you to be sure that right now." So I remember I went into a little closet at the old farmhouse where I grew up, and I said, "Lord, you and I both know this is unnecessary, but I want to please my mom. And so again, I want to give my life to you." And the Christian life's just a series of doing that over and over again. But I met Billy Graham for the first time when I was a young pastor. I was working in an Episcopal cathedral in South Carolina, working with high school and college kids. We had hundreds of young people involved in this ministry. And he came down, he spoke at the funeral of a great South Carolinian named Jimmy Byrne, who had been a leader in government back years ago. And I met him. I sat with him at the service and introduced myself. And later on, I wrote him a letter and asked him a question. He remembered, at least he said he remembered me. He wrote me an answer. So over the years, periodically, I would write him, I would hear from him. And then in the early 80s, he came to Washington, and we had the Washington, D.C. Billy Graham Crusade. And I worked with him. I was a part of the group dealing with follow-up after that. So I had opportunities to be with him. He was a hero, I would say. I had several mentors in my life. The amazing thing, I thought this morning of 6 mentors, and I don't need to tell you who they were, but the amazing thing was...
I want you to talk about mentors. You've talked about that over the years, and it helped me think about mentors and influence. I want you to touch on that. I will say, by the way, on Billy Graham, I stumbled upon a YouTube video of one of his what would you call those huge gatherings? I'm drawing the blank.
Crusades.
One of the Crusades, yeah. And what he was saying 60 years ago was still so relevant today. He was so powerful. Oh, my gosh.
Simple, direct. There was something about him that just spoke to people. The interesting thing was my mentors, looking back, were all ordained pastors.
Fascinating. I remember you've talked about it at a men's ministry out Stanway, and so help us understand that how you think about them, why they're important, how we benefit from a mentor.
You can have models, and models are people who you're not necessarily close to, but they represent something that you look to sort of as a hero. You'd like to be like them. But a mentor is someone who comes into your life, who takes an interest in you, and you have a relationship with, and they are further along in life than you are. They are accomplished in areas that you admire, and you have the opportunity to spend time with them. For instance, when I was a young pastor, we moved from South Carolina to Pittsburgh. And while we were there, we started a new Anglican seminary there. This is back in the mid-'70s. And the man who came to be the dean and president of that seminary became a mentor to me. I was 30 years old. He was in his 70s. And he had been an outstanding leader in East Africa most all of his adult life. He had been an Anglican missionary, became a bishop. And in the 20 years he was a bishop in Tanzania, a new church started on the average of once a week for 20 years.
Good gracious.
You can believe it.
Wow.
And it was part of the East Africa revival out there. Then in his late 60s, he retired. He went back to Australia. He came out of retirement and helped us found Trinity School, Trinity Anglican Seminary. But he was a... sort of bigger than life, a wonderful leader, a man of great administrative talent and ability, a man who had a gift of prayer. You don't meet many people who have the gift of faith, but he had the gift of faith, and that led him into a life of prayer that really had a huge influence on me. And he said, John, why don't you come over to my house on Friday afternoons? We'll sit in the garden, we'll have a cup of tea, and we'll just talk. He took me under his wing. He took an interest in me, and he shared with me lessons of life as a pastor, as a Christian leader. He asked me questions about what was going on. I think a mentor is someone who really cares about you and believes in you. Someone who sees gifts in you, who sees abilities. Maybe they're not very well developed, and he gives you advice and guidance, and he encourages you. I've always said that my mentors were cheerleaders for me.
Let me ask you a follow-up to that.
Yeah.
So for people listening, what advice would you have for looking for mentors, seeking mentors, or do they just come to you? And then also, how can you be a mentor? You're a phenomenal mentor to many as well. How do you think about both those things?
In my experience, I mostly my introductions to those people just came about through happenstance, Although John Stott was different. John Stott was a world-famous Anglican pastor from London.
One of the most influential evangelical pastors of our time.
He was a pastor to Billy Graham. And I think Billy Graham had as much respect for him as any man in the world. And they were about the same age. They worked closely together on a worldwide effort to bring together evangelical Christian leaders from around the world. It's called the Lausanne Movement. Mm-hmm. And Billy Graham and John Stott headed that up. And we can talk about that if you want to. But I didn't know this John Stott fella. And when I was at Princeton, I heard some of his sermons on tape. And I didn't know who he was, but I thought, man, this guy is really gifted. I'd like to know more about him. So I wrote him out of the blue. He was in London, and I wrote and said, look, I've heard about you.
I'm seeing a pattern here. You have to reach out. You reached out to Billy Graham, and you reached out to John Stott.
I did. Most of the others just sort of were brought to me. But John Stott, I reached out to, I wrote to, he wrote back. I eventually went to London and sat under his leadership. And when we came to Falls Church, I wrote him, I said, look, I need help. Next time you're in the States, would you please come to Falls Church, spend a few days with us, preach to my congregation, speak to them. And he ended up coming several times over the years. And then when he was in his 70s, my oldest son, John, worked with him, traveled all over the world as his study assistant. And we visited several times in London, and he was in our house many times. But he was a mentor from a distance. And he was always very straightforward with me, an encourager, not a flatterer, but just an encourager. And I learned so much from his example. You learn from the example of mentors, you learn from the advice of mentors, and you learn from the friendship of mentors.
Well, thank you. It comes up so much in these conversations and elsewhere about how important mentors are. Sir Isaac Newton's observation that I can see further when I stand on the shoulders of giants. Why not tap that wisdom that has come before you?
Yeah.
I think a lot of people are either intimidated or just don't know how to reach out or to see it or whatever. So thank you.
I think if you learn about someone, don't be afraid to reach out to them. If you meet someone who strikes you as, gosh, this is a significant person, don't be afraid to introduce yourself, to say, could we have coffee? I'd like to learn from you. I mean, if you say, I'd like to learn from you, that's pretty flattering.
Yes.
So people will respond.
I think a lot of people think that these very influential people are just inundated with requests.
Yeah.
They don't want to bother them.
Yeah.
But the reality is that that's actually not the case so much in terms of the mentoring opportunity. All right, well, let's switch gears. You mentioned the Falls Church. You were in Pittsburgh in 1979. You and Susan and your family were called. You were called to the Falls Church, a sleepy little dying church in the suburbs of Northern Virginia. Right. Interestingly, the Falls Church, Virginia, is named for the Falls Church.
Founded in 1732. George Washington's father was one of the leaders of the church in the beginning. And George Washington eventually became a member of the vestry of the Falls Church. And I think he chaired the building committee, but they built the original building that we were in for many years. Yeah.
The history is that George Washington's early life was influenced by that service and his sense of service. And I think George Mason was a vestryman. It was a hospital during the Civil War. A lot of history. You're called. Tell us a little bit about that. It's obviously an important part of the journey, not just because of the consequential nature, but because it was a calling. And
it was.
You had some doubt.
But a call is not always fun. It's not always something you expected. We lived in a suburb of Pittsburgh called Sewickley. And it's
a beautiful place.
It is the ideal little community. We thought we'd live there forever. I worked under a wonderful Englishman named John Guest, very, very gifted leader. I learned so much from John. He was another mentor. But my wife had just given birth to twins that gave us 5 children, 7 and under. And the very week that she was in the hospital having twins, I was preaching, and a group from this church in Virginia showed up at church, and they asked me to have lunch with them after church. And I had been recommended to them as someone they should consider. I was very young. I was just 32 years old. I had never been a senior pastor before, and I had absolutely no interest in talking to them. But my father-in-law had talked to me a few months earlier and said, if you never are willing to talk to people who come to you asking you to consider a change in location or change in job, you might miss God's call in your life. My father-in-law's words were ringing in my ears when these people from Virginia came up, and I said, I better talk to them. Anyway, and it turned out that, I ended up coming down and meeting with them, and they contacted me. It was amazing. They said, we believe you are the man that God has raised up to come and be our leader. They sent me a telegram. They said, we will simply wait until God shows you that this is the right thing.
Oh, wow.
You can believe that? Yeah. And I still have the telegram. My wife and I wept in each other's arms when finally we admitted to each other, we think this is the right thing.
Oh, wow.
And so we came, babies in arms. It was so hard. We didn't want to come. Northern Virginia is not a friendly place.
No, it's not.
Half the people here are just as new as you are. They don't know anybody any more than you do.
Very transient.
The church was, there were good people, but I must say we were not made to feel completely welcome. I was young. I had never led a church before. My hands were full. Susan was overwhelmed with all these babies. And it was a dry church. And they said they wanted renewal. But when I came as an evangelical church person, I think it was a little more than they expected. And I remember after a couple of years, we decided to put Bibles in the pews. You would not think that would have been controversial, but boy, that raised a stink among some people. And I remember on a vestry retreat, the leadership of the church, after a few years, the members were going around and they were sort of checking in, saying how they're feeling about things at the church. And I remember this one beautiful blonde-haired Virginia lady with lovely gold jewelry on, very attractive, looked at me and she said, I don't like you. I don't like your churchmanship. I don't like what you're doing to my church. The first years were pretty hard.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about this
They were
renewal.
good people.
Yeah.
Good people. And we came to love each other. But it took a lot of work to build understanding. I remember meeting with 5 members of the vestry every Saturday morning for months and months, just trying to talk about, John, you say this, but we don't understand what you mean. And a lot of clarifying had to go on during those first few years. They were not used to my enthusiastic approach, personal approach to the Christian life. Yeah.
Well, looking back, we could say the rest is history. It went on to become this very significant, large, influential church. Did you have a vision for the church? Did you have a vision for renewal? You know, in Proverbs, the Bible says, when there is no vision, the people perish. Did you come in with this, or what? Where were you?
By the time I came, I had been a pastor for nearly 10 years, and I had experienced in Sewickley what I hoped to see in our church. And I remember early on, I preached a sermon. I said, this is my dream for our church. But honestly, Kevin, it wasn't a dream for huge, big programs. It was more a vision for the qualities I wanted to be true of our congregation. And I wanted to be a consequential person. I did. I know I did. And if you feel that way, I'm sure it impacts the way you do things. But I was learning important lessons, and it was a long time before I began to have much in the way of influence beyond our local church. But I wanted our people. I wanted to have them understand that you can really have certainty about your relationship with God. It's not presumptuous to believe that God loves you. It's not presumption to believe that Christ can be real in your life. In the Christian faith, we believe you can have assurance of that, and you can have a genuine relationship with God. That's what I wanted from my people. I wanted them to become simply what I would call self-feeding. I didn't want them to be dependent upon me or books. I wanted them to learn how to pray, how to read the Bible for themselves, and to become to grow on their own in the faith. I wanted them to feel confident knowing how to talk about the reality of God in this world and in our lives. I wanted them to experience this sense of calling in life. I wanted our people to believe that God has his hand on you, he has his eye on you, and there are certain ways he wants to use you. And if you can discern what his calling is for your life, you can live a strong and fulfilled life. And I guess I'd just say the other thing I really wanted was, I've always had a burden for young people and for families. I wanted to be a church where we weren't boring kids with the gospel. I wanted them to know that God in their lives. And I wanted to help families raise their children in the Christian faith. The first book I wrote was about how to help families have Christ-centered family life. So those were things that were on my mind when I first came.
Well, a little bit more on that. I mean, I remember growing up in church, mainline Protestant church. My parents, we went every Sunday, but I kind of dreaded it because it was boring.
Yeah,
and
me too. Me too.
But that
I used to fall asleep on my knees.
Oh, well, but that's not the false church. And my wife Ann and I did not start going until almost 20 years after you had started.
Yeah.
But we know many people today, good friends who started in those early days. They weren't there necessarily in 79.
Yeah.
But word spread in the Washington, D.C. area that there's a church that's alive out in the suburbs. There's this young pastor, John Yates. You talked about the focus on families and young people, but what sort of leadership principles did you have in mind as well? I mean, I love the idea that you were engaging and winning over the leadership, the lay leadership of the church? Because that wouldn't have worked if you just tried to force your way. What were some of the leadership principles?
The first 5 years we're working on leadership, trying to build trust. And then after the first 5 years, we began to experience a sense of unity in the parish. Some people left for various reasons, not many, but we were inundated with people from the beginning. And I think, a young pastor with a beautiful wife and young kids, that appeals to young people. Yeah. And so, and we're in a good central location, which was easy. And we did experience a lot of exciting stuff. One of the things I learned about leadership was, I always tried to do two things. I always tried to pay attention to the visions that people brought to me, because people would come and say, we need to do this, we need to do that. And
you've always been a very patient listener.
Well, I always had my own ideas, but I wanted people to know that they're important. And so, what I finally learned to say was, if I thought it was a good idea, I would say, I love this. I want you to see if you can find 3 or 4 other people who share this vision with you and would be excited about where, like, say somebody wanted to start a bookstore, a great idea. We need this, but come back when you've got some people who want to be committed to that with you. And then we'll talk about it. But
what a great idea. I mean, you were engaging them in leadership by getting them involved, but they had to demonstrate some initial market support.
If they wanted to do something themselves, I needed to be sure they could do it. The visions that I brought were I needed to be sure. In other words, if I had a vision for something like the Fellows program, we'll talk about that in a minute, I needed to get people to help me with it. But I felt that if it was something really important, I wanted to take leadership first. I wanted to bring this thing into being, but I wanted to have people who would walk with me and observe where we were going and share in that vision with me. As time would go by, I would turn over responsibilities to them and eventually give them the responsibility. So the principles I followed were, first do it, see it and do it yourself, then bring along someone alongside who can buy into it and learn from you, and gradually turn it over to them, and eventually give the leadership to them, and you'd be way in the background, encouraging them from behind.
Those are some great insights, great lessons. And now I can understand all the various ministries. There's so many grew, and you couldn't have done them by directing them. But they had to be sort of through a bottom-up empowerment, really. And you were alongside them, though.
Well, the leader can't do everything, but if you turn responsibilities to others, you got to be really sure they can do it.
Right.
When you and Ann came to the church, it was in the 90s. And by then we had gone through huge building programs. Some ministries had become very strong in the church, and it was a fun time mostly. But I remember about the time you all came, there were 3 things that I was focusing on. I don't know if you remember, but around early 90s, I began to have a desire to spend more time with the men of the church.
The men's ministry was huge.
Yeah, and so I pulled aside a little group of men and I said, I get so frustrated because on Sundays I preach to families, little children, everybody's in there. There's so much I'd like to share with you all that I just can't share on Sunday mornings. There's some great jokes I'd like to tell you, but they're kind of appropriate just for men. And would you guys like to get together? So we started with like a dozen men and a meeting once a month, but that became a very strong aspect of the church. Eventually you would have a couple of hundred men coming together once a month. And we built a very strong group of men. Nothing against women in the church. I don't know what we would have done without our women leadership, but a lot of churches are run by women. And I wanted to have men who were just as strong as the women in our church. And that was just great.
No,
fun.
it was a big deal. And in those sessions, those ministries, I mean, you went into some deep, tough subjects, but you're right. You couldn't have done in a normal worship service. That's good. Very good. By the way, you have this great book about how a man prays for his family. We'll talk about some of these other books.
Yeah, that came out of the time with men. I don't know if you know this, Kevin, but one year I spent the whole year teaching the men about prayer. And then someone came to me and said, why don't you write a book about this? That's how that book came about. But at the same time, a man came to me and he said, you've been talking about prayer so much. It must be really important. And he said, I wonder if you don't need us to pray for you. And I said, gee, that'd be really great. I need it. He said, I'll get together 30 men and ask them to agree to pray for you one day a week. I'll even ask them to fast and skip a meal and pray for you one day a month. And let's see how that goes. And so he did that. And I gave those men something that I wanted them to pray for. And so they did. So after a first year, one day someone said to me, how's your year been? And I stopped and I thought, wow, my year, God, it's been a great year. I thought about it. I wonder why it's been such a great year. And then I thought, I've got 30 men who've been praying for me. And I told him that. And he said, well, if this has been a good year, maybe I could get 60 men next year. You'd have twice as good a year. Kevin, I ended up having 200 men praying for me, fasting and praying for me. I would send out a little card once a month. You were probably on the list. Card with a picture, a paragraph, and 3 or 4 things that were
we could pray for you about.
Yeah, and
maybe travel, maybe speaking, maybe something going on in the church, finding a new staff member,
a problem with a child, a health problem, something. We shared life together, and it made a huge difference.
Okay, so speak a little bit more about that. So I learned from you in the church the power of prayer and praying for others. And, I will now often ask somebody, how can I pray for you? Something I never would have dreamed of asking. Yeah. And it's very meaningful to the person even to be asked that question. Here we are at your farm. I remember every summer about this time, you would collect prayer requests from everyone in the church.
Yeah.
And you'd spend at least a week fasting and praying individually over each person's prayer request that you received. And then you'd send us a note about how you prayed for it. I don't know how you did that. I will say your handwriting was a little tough to read after writing 800 notes or so. But tell us about that. And how should anybody listening think about receiving prayer and offering prayer?
The Bible teaches us that we've been created by God and that God loves us. And Jesus taught us to think of God as our Father in heaven. And he said, you should take your concerns to my Heavenly Father in prayer. I really think, Kevin, if it's a concern to you, it's a concern to God. People might say that's crazy, that's being presumptuous, but God can know all people. He's not limited, and he's created us to be his children. And so I've always believed that prayer is real, that prayer is effectual, and God hears and answers. He doesn't always give us what we pray for, but he may answer yes, he may answer no. He may say, you're not ready for that. And sometimes he might even say, what, you asked that? You got to be kidding, son. But in the 90s, I began to feel that I needed to be a better pastor to the people. And I thought that a pastor should pray. A shepherd should pray for his sheep, And so I did. I sent a note out to everybody and said, I'm going to go away and pray for you. if there's some way you want to let me know how to pray for you, I will pray for you. And it developed into I suppose I did it maybe the last 20, 25 years of my ministry at Falls Church. I would do that. When we worked out a system so people could send me confidentially, but my secretary would address envelopes to people, and I was able to write a response. But every summer I got hundreds and hundreds of letters from people. And, the preacher always thinks that his sermons are the most important thing that he does. That's what he really spends time on and all of it. I wish I could tell you the number of people who came to me and said, John, we love your leadership. We love your preaching. But what you do that means the most to us is that you pray for us.
Oh, yeah. Well, let me ask you something about that. I've always wanted to ask you, you spend a week out here at the farm, I don't know, it's by yourself, you're fasting.
Yeah, it's by myself. Yeah.
And you're receiving 800 or so requests that are probably not pleasant. I mean, no, people are praying for needs, and they're unleashing some needs that are deep and profound. And how do you personally handle that?
Yeah, it's part of my calling, so I know it's the right thing to do. You have to sort of get yourself geared up. And I can't say I look forward to it every year. I mean, my flesh dreaded it, but I wanted to focus completely on what I was doing. And so, of course, I wouldn't let my wife or anybody be here with me. I would have a stack of envelope letters from people. I would sit and I would read their letter. Many times I got 3-4 page typewritten letters from people. Some people began to see it as an annual visit with me. And free people are sort of like an annual report to the pastor, and they say, here's what's been going on, John. And
on January 17th.
Yeah, I remember one fellow wrote me one year and he said, I've been wanting to get married for a long time. I'm going to ask you, please pray that God would give me a wife. So next year I got a letter from the same guy. He wrote back, he said, I still don't have a wife. This is the second time I've asked you to pray. Would you please pray that I get a wife? Next year, I get another letter from this guy. He says, I've asked you 2 years in a row to pray for a wife. I still don't have one. 3 strikes and you're out. So I prayed for him again. And I don't know. He eventually went off on his own and married the wrong one. It didn't work out. But there were a lot of funny things.
Oh, wow.
But it was, it demands.
Wasn't it overwhelming?
Totally focusing on the letter before you, trying to just think about that person and bring their need to God and intercede for them. And you wonder, is there something I need to say to them? And then the hard thing is you pray, and then you have to move on to the next person. And so I found that if I started early in the morning and prayed on into the evening, I could cover about 100 letters a day.
Wow.
And yeah, it was very exhausting. I couldn't do much else. And after the first few years I started at least eating a hard-boiled egg each morning. And I drank a lot of water.
Well, doing that in terms of fasting and in this, oh, wow. Well, let me ask you actually a related question too that you touched on. So when you're at a period like you were building the church, and we'll say like the growth period of our lives, that tends to be the moment when we are newly married, have young children. We're trying to raise our family while we're in this growth period of life.
Yeah.
How did you balance all those demands? I mean, if you were having to meet on Saturday mornings, that's a big demand. You were visiting people in the hospitals. And what advice would you have for any of us about how we think about that or advise our children and grandchildren to think about it?
I've known so many men especially, but now women too, who at the time when their family needs them the most, it's the time when they're trying hardest to build their career.
Right.
There's so many conflicts. I would just say, honestly, I don't think I did it very well.
Well, you got a beautiful family. They're very engaged with you. But Susan does say in her books that you were traveling a lot or you weren't home a lot.
Well, I married someone who was very capable and very patient and very honest. Honestly, I'd have to be honest to say that over the years, by far, the most painful arguments we had were about time together, not being around as much as she needed me. And so I people say, what are you doing now? And I say, I'm just saying yes to my wife. And I'm glad I've lived long enough to do that. But during those days when things were so stressful and so hard, I guess I had a few priorities. I certainly the priority of trying to share with and be with my wife, I struggled to try to do that as much as I could. And by the time we'd been married 25 years or so, I was doing a little bit better job of it. But the other principle was to be with my children as much as I could. Never felt like it was enough. But I tried to establish certain patterns of being with them. But the main thing was to take time to maintain a rich connection with the Lord myself. If I wasn't getting personally nourished in my own life with God, I certainly couldn't do the work that I had to do. So those were sort of the principles that I had to be true to those things. The Lord came first, my wife and family came second, and then the work came after that. It seemed like the work took more time and more energy than anything else, but I knew in my heart what was most important. And you're always striving to live up to that, but you often feel like you're not making it.
Well, you'll have done a great job teaching about that. The books, Raising Kids with Values That Last, Building a Home Full of Grace. Strongly recommend these excellent books. They have weathered over time because they're written a while ago.
Yeah.
You'll still speak about that. But especially for the church being in the Washington, D.C. area with people coming to Washington, to Congress, their families may be back home in their districts, that's got to be tough. Really tough.
So tough for those folks. The pressures they're under. And if those people can just develop some friendships here in Washington, there's so much rancor now. And, when we moved here in the 70s, politics have always been hard, but there were friendship across party lines in those days. And most of the congressmen lived here. Their children went to school locally. Those people would stand on the sidelines at soccer matches with people across party lines, and they knew each other better. We don't have any of that now, and it's a huge challenge.
It really is. I interviewed Newt Gingrich recently, and he talked about how even though he and Bill Clinton were adversaries, they worked together to get some of those reforms done. The friendship that Reagan and Tip O'Neill had, and well, all right. Well, let me.
I just say about that. It's true for their families too. When Bill Clinton came to the White House, my wife and a few other women had gotten to know her a little bit, Hillary, and they went to her and said, "Hillary, we just want to pray for you. We don't necessarily agree with all your politics, but you're here. We want to pray for you." So they started a little group and meeting together once a month just to pray for the First Lady.
Wow.
And many times Hillary Clinton came and joined in with them in prayer. She very much appreciated it. She joined in with them, and they've kept that. They call it the First Ladies Group. They still meet today. They're mostly old now. They meet on the phone now to pray, but it's a great thing. People in leadership need to know that they're being prayed for.
Well, I remember George W. Bush talked about how he felt the prayers of people as well. Yeah. All right. Well, let's go back to the Falls Church. So one of your many gifts, in my judgment, is your ability to raise up talent and then the consequential nature of that talent. There's the Fellows program. If you would talk a little bit about that. I work with many fellows still today. Some are recent fellows. Some were fellows 20 or more years ago. They're awesome. Yeah. And then also the Timothies about raising up leaders in the church. I remember that article that Fred Barnes wrote, I think, for the Washington Post about how you asked him to go start a church in Alexandria.
Wall Street Journal.
Wall Street Journal,
I went and said, it's time for you to leave.
Yes, exactly. Well said. Let's start with the Fellows and then the Timothies. What is it? And what can others learn from it?
Okay. So, I've always had a concern for young people, to help young people grow up, find God's calling for their lives, and go flat out for life and for the Lord. And so we began to sense about 30 years ago that young people a lot of them were sort of losing their way, were not sure about where to go in life. And it's even gotten worse now in the 2020s. So much confusion among young people today. But I just wanted to start some sort of a program whereby we could bring young people together and teach them a deeper understanding of the Christian faith, expose them to men and women in positions of service and leadership who were significantly serving the community, the nation, the Lord, and also expose them to a good local church, which many of them hadn't experienced. And so I pulled together some friends and we began to talk about this, and we developed a vision that we called the Falls Church Fellows. And now this Fellows vision has spread across the country. There are many, many churches that are a part of sort of a national network, the expanded Fellows network. But the way we did it was we recruited about a dozen, seldom more than 12, young men and women just out of college, and brought them to Northern Virginia, and we took care of their room and board. We got them a part-time job in an area that they were interested in. If they were interested in politics, we tried to get them a job on Capitol Hill. If they were interested in medicine, we tried to get them a job working for a doctor, whatever. And we sought to teach them. I had a seminary professor come in and teach them one morning a week. We wanted them to experience rich community, deep friendships. We wanted to build relationships that would last in their lives, and they have. And I'll never forget the first fellows class. About half those kids were all in my daughter's wedding.
There was a North Carolina influence and Virginia influence to a lot of them.
But the word began to spread. Mm-hmm. It was so helpful for these kids. Once a week on a Friday morning, we would bring in someone like Kevin Gentry, who would speak to the fellows and would sort of tell their story. Look, here's what I'm doing in life now. Here's how I got here. Here's how I'm trying to serve God in the world today. And we would connect each of these young people with a mentor for the year. We would take them through, we would give them aptitude tests, talent tests, and things to try to help them figure out what they might be good at. And we would try to guide them as they began to plan their life. And it's interesting, every year at least half these kids stay in Washington, D.C.,
Well, one of the other benefits is they often stay in that church, and it brings up a younger element, and they raise their families. This congratulations, because the consequential nature of that is substantial, and we'll see those consequences for a long time. As I say, I'm still working with, there are a dozen I can rattle off the top of my head that I'm working with in various ways that came through. And some of them, not only the Falls Church Fellows, but Fellows programs that came from the Falls Church Fellows program. It's called the Fellows Initiative. If people want to look into maybe doing that for their church.
Go online, the Fellows Initiative. There's several churches across the country. And then And so we have this national fellowship. There are lots of other churches who've heard about what we were doing, and they said, we're going to do that. And they've started their own Fellows programs sort of on their own. They're not a part of the Fellows Initiative. And it's not just churches. There are communities who've said, we want to do this in our community. And there are, Kevin, there are thousands of young men and women now who've been through either our Fellows program or other similar Fellows programs, who've been helped, who've been given a step up the ladder in life, and are now serving the Lord and serving their communities and serving their churches significantly.
It's a great framework. And you introduce mentors at an earlier age and so many connections. And okay, now let's talk about the Timothies. You had a vision for renewal that involved more than just the Falls Church. It was to go beyond other churches.
I thought we need to be training young leaders for the church. And it occurred to me that probably the best way to do the work of evangelism is by starting new churches. And I remember that was when we were in the Episcopal Church, and I went to our dear bishop and said, we'd like to start a new church. And he was against it. He said, I don't think you need to do that. We got plenty of churches in Northern Virginia.
I've been with you on that.
Yeah.
Because when this seems to be a pattern in life, that when somebody is growing fast, doing some big things, some resentment can, I don't want to say necessarily it's resentment or suspicion or skepticism, or maybe it's just a mentality. That happens. And what happens? And then what do you deal with that? And then we'll get more back into the
I think in the mainline church, this has been true. If
it's in business, it's in the nonprofit world, it's in government. When you grow fast and are seemingly a threat, even though you're not a threat, then people just shut down.
That was our experience. People said, well, those people over at Falls Church, they must be a bunch of fundamentalists.
Yeah,
you know?
Right. Because there's no way they could be doing what they're doing.
Right. They're tricking people, you know. And it was funny, the denomination, they really wanted our money, but they weren't interested in our methods or in us as a model. And that was disappointing. Yeah, that was hard. And but in our denomination, we saw some real bright spots, but mainly the denomination was drying up. The leadership was moving away from traditional Orthodox Christian doctrine. They were embracing there was no discipline in the church. There was no discipline of bishops who said, I don't believe in the resurrection. Or I remember one bishop said, well, the church wrote the Bible. We can rewrite it now, you know. There was no...
Yeah, those miracles are metaphors. There's no virgin birth.
And it was a hard time, so that if we have time, we can talk about how eventually we decided that we just weren't going to stay there. But you ask about the young pastors.
And brother, you've got them pastoring now churches in Richmond and Winchester and Alexandria and Arlington and even places outside of Virginia, Vienna, and that's what's growing. That's what's growing.
We've been very fortunate and very blessed. I came up with this idea that I would look for young men who had been to seminary, who had some experience in life, and who wanted to start churches of their own. And we would bring them in, and they served on our staff for 2 or 3 years, usually 3 years. We tried to take them through the different aspects of leadership in the church, tried to help clarify their vision for the church. And then as they were here, their vision about where they wanted to start a church, how they wanted to go about it would become stronger. I would usually give them the responsibility for the Saturday night service, let them actually lead that for 6 months or a year or so. Great experience for them. And we began to send them out one at a time with a group of people from our church, because originally the churches we started were, within a half an hour or 45 minutes of Falls Church. And so they would take a group with them.
Right. By the way, they would take a group from the Falls Church with them, but the Falls Church kept growing. I think that's a very interesting
we just sort of assumed that would happen, but it did. I remember.
Many people think it's a fixed pie.
Yeah.
But when you're doing something like this, it's like pruning a tree. You're actually spurring greater growth.
It seemed to work that way, Kevin. And I remember when one young man took 200 members of our church, and I went and met with them when they first started meeting, and I looked around and said, I can't believe I let all of you all leave. But that's the way we decided to do it. And we would pay the salary of this young man for the first year. We said, we can give you a year to get on your feet and to get things worked out. We helped them organize administratively, helped them organize financially. People would go with them. Some of our best leaders went with these young church leaders. But we did this over a period of about, 13, 14 years. And I think we started 10 or 11 churches. And there's one up in Portland, Maine, who I'm still not sure whether it's a full-fledged church or just a big, small group. And there were a couple that ultimately didn't make it, but the rest made it. And they are...
they're thriving. Yeah. I know. I know. And I follow many of them.
We started is in Richmond, Virginia.
And now they've started a church.
They've started 2 churches themselves. And they're finally, I heard the other day, they finally got property. They're going to build a building of their own. It's been very exciting. And I tried to find young men who I thought had leadership ability, who I thought had a strong heart for the Lord, who had good marriages. And,
well, it's remarkable, John, the consequential nature of this. This is, again, this is why the biggest reason I thought about you with respect to going big, because these 2 visions you had tied to renewal based on that principle, with respect to the Fellows and the Timothies, has just impacted thousands and thousands more than you could have even done just from the Falls Church because of the leveraged manner of it. And again, we're going to see the benefits of that for years, and others can learn lessons from this and apply it in their case. It's amazing. All right. I want to begin to draw this to a close, but we can't close it out until really we address the biggest thing that happened, and that was respect to renewal, what was going on in the broader Episcopal Church. It's covered very well in this great book by Josh Simmons, The Awakening of Washington's Church. Great play on both George Washington and Washington, D.C. Just what began to happen, and then when did it become impossible? And then we'll walk through a little bit. It's in and of itself, it is an extraordinary going big story.
It needed a good book like that. I'm so grateful.
It's excellent. And I've given this to others in the Presbyterian Church, in the Methodist Church, and others who are trying to figure out in similar ways what to do.
Around 2000, there a trickle began of leaders in the Episcopal Church who felt that the church has moved away from its doctrines and its most important traditions. We've worked very hard to try to bring renewal. It is not working. And
to be fair, you're kind. I would say the national leadership really didn't believe anything. It wasn't even a church.
Things got really bad there for a while.
Right.
And I used to be embarrassed to tell people that I was an Episcopalian. But anyway, I've got many good friends who are still there. There's some wonderful people there, but it got tough. And we began to wonder if perhaps what we were called to was to begin a new movement, an Anglican church in the United States, because that's the background of the Episcopal Church.
Right.
We spent about 3 years in our church.
Anglican church meaning its roots in England.
Yes. We spent about 3 years as the leadership of our church praying, thinking, debating this. And eventually I took a group of about 15 pastors of other Episcopal churches to our bishop, and I said, Bishop, we feel we can no longer in good conscience remain in the denomination. We want to leave. We want to figure out a way that we can stay in our buildings. We want you to let us go. We want to figure out with you a way that is fair to keep our property. We spent a couple of years trying to figure out how to do that. And when we finally figured out a way to do that and our bishop agreed, at that time, the National Episcopal Church stepped in and said, no, if you want to leave, you have to leave. We own your property.
And by the way, what then happened was so drastic. Just say a word.
Yeah.
I mean, the members of the church effectively were sued. Things happened to you.
About 95% of our church members voted, we have to leave. We think this property is ours. And so we did that, and the National Episcopal Church sued us. They sued me. They sued the vestry. They sued the church. They said that the property belongs to us. Now, it was the local people who built the church. We raised all that money to build that building, and the deeds were in the name of the vestry of the Falls Church. But that began a 7-year period of legal wrangling. I think if we had known it was going to be like that, we probably would have just said, keep it, we're gone.
And by the way, originally, the Fairfax Circuit Court ruled in the favor of the Falls Church and the church is leaving.
That's
a
right.
long opinion, very well thought out. But the Virginia Supreme Court said no, and that the National Church had it. And so then what happened?
It took 7 years to work through that lawsuit. And we really thought we were going, we did everything as well as we could, as honestly as we could, as thoroughly as we could, and as prayerfully as we could. You never get things exactly right, but it was our desire to please God. That was our desire. And so when we got word that the Virginia Supreme Court had ruled against us, and this was like in March, we had to be out by May of, I think it was 2012. We were quite surprised. We were very disappointed. But, what do? You've done everything you can. The answer is no. Are you going to go cry? Are you going to curse? Are you going to be angry? None of that would have been worthwhile.
But what does it mean to be out? I mean,
it meant
you effectively thrown on the street.
Yeah, we were. It meant everything.
As a pastor, did it affect your health insurance or retirement or
everything? Everything. I had to fight for my retirement, but I had been in 30 years by then, so I was vested, so I was able to keep that. But the house we were living in as a family, we lost. All the church buildings, we lost. All the prayer books, all the Bibles, all the equipment, all the money that we had as a church was lost. I'll never forget the day that we had to turn over our keys to the denomination. I had a vacuum cleaner run. I was trying to vacuum my office out so it would be okay. It'd be presentable for the people who came in.
By the way, I remember your son-in-law reaching out to the men of the church saying, please come over and let's just clean up and make this as nice as possible.
They did. They were
putting it in the best shape.
The nail holes in the walls and painting. And I remember my daughter, I couldn't believe my daughter actually brought a cake in. She said, I just baked this for the minister who's coming. And she put it on his desk. She said, welcome. It's yours now. I mean, we tried to be gracious. And I remember God gave me a passage of scripture that really helped me get through that time. That week, when we learned that we had lost the property, I read in the Gospel of John a verse that gave me the courage to believe that we were going to be all right. It's where Jesus was talking to the disciples just before his crucifixion. It's in John chapter 13. He said, what I'm doing now, you do not understand. but one day you will understand. I took that to the congregation. I said, look, this thing is in God's hands. We do not understand what God is doing, but one day we will understand. And Kevin, that was 15 years ago. I guarantee if you go to any member of our church who was in our church at that time and you said to them, do you think we did the wrong thing? Are you sad we did what we did? Should we have done otherwise? I don't think you'll find anyone who says we did the wrong thing.
Agreed.
And I don't think you'll find anyone who says we realize now that God was doing something different. That enabled us to start training Timothies, to plant daughter churches. It enabled us to reach out to think so much bigger. And who would have ever thought that now we'd be in this amazing office building? And
well, let's speak to that. Okay, so you're jumping ahead a little bit because this is the story.
Yeah.
I mean, so we talked about, you're called to the false church as a dying church. It's revived. There's renewal going on. The Fellows, the Timothies, these men's ministry, all these ministries is flourishing. And then on principle, you must leave and you're left with nothing. Help us understand now what happened, because it wasn't an immediate turnaround. And by the way, speak to, if you would, that last service at the church. Yeah. That was an extraordinary experience.
The last Sunday, we met Sunday morning, but then we met Sunday night, and we had a couple thousand people that crowded in, I guess. And it was a time we said, we're not going to be sad. We're going to praise God.
By the way, I remember your children sitting on the front row.
Really? I asked all of the young men who were in training. I think we had 7 at that time. I said, I'm going to give each of you 4 or 5 minutes to say what you want to say to the congregation. And that was very moving to hear each one of those young men speak words of encouragement, words of faith to the church. And then we had prayer to commit the future to God, and we prayed that he would protect this property that we had loved. And then we said, we'll let you know where we're going to meet next Sunday. We didn't know. So that led to a period of 7 years.
7 years of what we call tabernacling. Maybe it was, I don't know, 7 years in the wilderness.
One place after another. And the amazing thing was it didn't weaken the church family.
No, it didn't. It did. But it was not even a reliable place. It would be a hotel one week. It would be an elementary school another week.
Email. Here's where we're meeting.
Bishop O'Connell, a Catholic school, gave us their auditorium. Columbia Baptist Church.
We couldn't find any place that was reliable. And finally, I went to the Roman Catholic Bishop of Arlington, and I said, you've read about what we're doing. I've said, your Bishop O'Connell High School is the only place I have found that is not being rented now, that is big enough to accommodate us. I know you're sympathetic with us. You're a man of God. I know you care. I know you have friends who are Anglican bishops. Would you consider letting us rent your property? And but doggone if he didn't do it.
Oh, it was extraordinary.
He did, and we met for 2 or 3 years. That's what really saved us.
Oh, but meeting in the auditorium on Sunday morning, and maybe they had a play the night before, Romeo and Juliet. The set would still be on the stage, and you'd be moving along amongst these pieces, and you kept on. It was
a lot of work, and we tried to get as many people as possible involved and set up, take down. We were running. I thought I'd be retired by then, but we were running.
Well, that's another thing. You were trying to retire. So speak to 2 things. One was the amazing, unexpected gifts that happened. I think the story of the communion instruments was extraordinary. And then also how you found the new space and where we are today.
Yeah, it was just phenomenal to see how God answered prayers. When one of the things that's important to people in our tradition is the communion service, which is the heart of our worship. And we had early colonial American pewter and silver that we used in the communion service. Precious, historic, and we lost all that. And around about the time we were leaving, the lady who was in charge of that came to me and said, "What are we going to do?" I said, "I guess you'll have to go to the thrift store and find stuff to use." And one day, a man came to our church and he asked if he could see me. Somebody had taken him to the boardroom and he was there. And I went down, and on the table that seated about 15 people, the table was covered with antique sterling communion silver that he had been collecting for at least 10 or 15 years. He's an antique dealer. He read an article about our church, and he said, "I'm going to help them out." He came down and he gave all of this to us. And when I shared the picture of this with the congregation, it was like, gosh, we're going to be all right, you know. And we were. People were extraordinarily generous. They had to dig deep during that time. And I'll never forget, one day a man came into our church. It was a temporary office. I think I had a cardboard desk. And he said, "We love what you're doing. We had a major sale. We're not rich people, but we got some stock. We sold it. We got more money than we ever dreamed we'd have. I want to give you a gift." He put a check for $100,000 on my desk that day. I was just weeping, you know. Things like that were happening. Our needs were met. And then our leadership began to develop pretty radical visions about where we might go, what might be our eventual home. And our people led us to a piece of property that it's just mind-blowing how well it's worked.
It really is. And to build that kind of place inside the Beltway in Washington, D.C., which is not a place where a lot of new churches spring up anymore.
Yeah.
So close us out with that. You're trying to retire. You've been there 40 years. You had some knee surgery. You've had some other things to deal with. I remember you were taking Ubers to parishioners' house because you couldn't drive because of your knee. To meet with various folks, and but you found this property. The church found this property, and you also, our church found a successor to you, which is when a big person steps out in leadership, almost effectively founding that modern church. It's tough, and it was somebody actually that you had trained up as a Timothy, Sam Ferguson, an amazing pastor, just amazing preacher. Just close us out with that, and then I've got two closing questions for you.
People came to me and said, "John, we think there's a possibility that we could buy this office building, and that could be our headquarters. We could rent out most of it, and that would enable us to pay the mortgage on that building. There's enough property to build a church there." Fairfax County came in and said, "You need to build a parking garage to accommodate 552 cars." We had to do that before we could build the church. So our leadership had come to me and said, "John, you've worked hard. We love you. We want you to be able to retire, but we really need you to see us through this time. Please don't step aside until we've got a new place and we feel like we're on our feet." And the call to come to Falls Church had always been strong. The reason I never left to take any other job was God always said, "You stay where you are. I'm not finished with you yet. I've still got work for you to do." And so I had no idea that we could raise enough money to purchase this land, this office building, to do what we did. But I learned two things. I learned that I learned again that God is faithful. And secondly, I learned that if you are trying to raise money for something good people believe in, they will give. And the third thing I learned was a lot of people in Washington have a lot more money than I knew they had. I never cared about that. But all those snowy night visits in people's homes were precious, and people gave generously. And so it worked out. And we began building the building. We could see it. We could see what it was going to be like. And so I went to our leadership and I said, it's time to call somebody to take my place. I'm going to be in my mid-70s. My wife needs me. We set up a committee. I set up the committee with the vestry's permission, but I said, I will not be on it. I don't want to choose my successor. Yeah, I'd love it if you call my son, but I'd probably be awkward. You do what you think is right.
And we did an international search. We interviewed candidates from other countries, and lots of different people applied.
Yep.
And I know it must have been tough not knowing exactly what we were going to do. I think we were actually in our basement at our home the night when the vestry announced the decision.
Wow.
And you joined us, but we didn't know what the decision. You didn't know what the decision was going to be.
I thought it would be wrong if I tried to influence this decision. And so
good for you, because there are a lot of leaders that couldn't do that, and that creates a lot of challenge.
But I was so happy with the choice. It was a great blessing to be able to introduce him to the congregation that day and turn over the reins of leadership to him.
Well, the church is thriving, and it's thriving in so many ways. All right, here are the wrap-up questions. First, for young pastors today, now thinking back even over your life, but even where they are today, I believe you still have a community of these young pastors. You bring them out here to the farm.
I try to stay closely connected with and be some sort of a mentor to young pastors. Our Timothies, most of our Timothies still meet with them as I can, and they do come. We all meet here at the farmhouse twice a year for an overnight retreat, and we have a great time together. They're mentoring other people now, but it's a blessing. And I guess there's so many things that I try to communicate to these young men, but I would say if I'm talking to a young man who's trying to find God's way in his life and do well, whether it's leading a church or whatever, I would say, first of all, love, listen to, and pray with your wife. That's the first thing I'd say. And then I'd say, learn what you do best. Figure out where your gifts are and where they're not. Pay attention to your dreams. Pay attention to the things that get you really excited. As you get moving, try to find people who have gifts that you don't have. You can't do it all. You need to find people who are better than you are in certain ways. Have close, trusted friends who know you well, who will give you good, honest feedback on how you're doing as a person, how you're doing as a leader in the work that you're called to do. People who will be truly devoted to you, who will encourage you, but who will confront you when you need it. Most leaders don't like that. A real leader, a godly leader wants feedback, wants to know when he's screwing up. He doesn't like to hear it, but he knows he needs to and he wants to. And I'd say, when you're a young man, you got to figure out the principles that are going to determine the kind of man you're going to be. Figure out what those guiding principles are and always stay true to them.
Well, let me take it back to the beginning about finding your gift, your calling. What would you say to people who are listening or watching today who think maybe they know their calling, but they just can't quite step out in faith? What advice would you give?
You know, the perfect opportunity may just present itself, and that's wonderful if that happens. But someone said to me, you can't drive a parked car. It's got to be rolling if you're going to steer it somewhere. So you've got to start and move. You've got to figure out what direction you want to move in and start moving in that direction and see how it goes. People have different talents. Jesus said there are 1 talent people, 5 talent people, 10 talent people. You never know what you're going to be able to do. But you might as well think as big as you can and try to discern where you have passion and pursue it in any way that you can. Pay attention to people in your life who inspire you. And try to find a way to learn from what you've learned from them and begin to put some building blocks together in your own life. You don't have to put that many together at first. But I would say you want to live a life that is helpful to other people. If you just want to make a lot of money and take care of yourself, God bless you. That's not what I'm interested in. I want to encourage people to live a life where they make a difference in the community and in the nation. And so I would say, whatever you feel you're called to do, learn to pay attention to people. Always have relationships with people and figure out what concerns people have, what things are hard for people in life, where they need help, and try to figure out ways that you can help. I mean, if you're living in Falls Church and you've got kids in elementary school and you begin to meet other parents who they're concerned about the quality of the schools, and run for the school board or whatever you can do. Try to find ways that you can serve other people and pursue them, whether it's through your work or just through your volunteer activities. I think start with small goals. Don't be afraid to fail. We all fail. That's how we learn important lessons. But don't go it alone. I guess that would be the theme song of my life. Don't go it alone.
Nice.
You've got to be closely connected with other people who help you, who believe in you, and who you can love.
All right. Well, the last question, I do want to sort of take it back to the beginning, but for anyone who's listening, wherever they may be in their faith journey, what sort of going out encouragement, inspiration would you offer to anyone listening about how they can just go big in their life with respect to the gifts they've been given?
I want to say life is hard. Don't kid yourself about that. Jesus said, in the world, you're going to have troubles. Don't kid yourself about that. If you expect a life of ease, good luck to you. You've got to be willing to give yourself to grow into the best person you can be. And that takes hard work and commitment and the help of other people. I want to say God loves you. God has made you with certain strengths and certain weaknesses. And the best way to get to know those is to get to know Him. And the best way to get to know Him is to look to His Son, Jesus Christ, learn from Him. I often think if anyone could meet Jesus Christ, they'd love Him. There's so many misconceptions about Him, So I say, go for Him. You may be a 10-talent person. You may be a 1-talent person. You are the way God has made you. But if you're willing to step out in faith, if you're willing to pray big, if you're willing to seek the help of other people, you may end up accomplishing a lot more than you think you can. In fact, I will promise you, your life will turn out to be very different than you think it will be. It will be harder than you think it will be, but in some ways it will be so much more wonderful than you think it would be. Don't give up. Don't quit. Don't be discouraged. Keep growing.
John Yates, what a pleasure it's been to be with you today. As always, thank you for all that you continue to do, for your years of dedication and leadership, and for the inspiration, and look forward to many more to come. Thank you.
I'm a blessed man.
Indeed. Thanks for tuning in to the Going Big podcast. I hope today's conversation left you feeling energized and ready to tackle your biggest goals. Don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review on iTunes, YouTube, or wherever you listen to podcasts. It really helps spread the word, and it gets these inspiring stories out to more people. You can also find more content, resources, and updates at our website, goingbigpodcast.com. Remember, the only limits are the ones you don't challenge, the limits that you impose on yourself. Keep pushing, keep growing, and above all, keep going big. See you next time on the Going Big Podcast.